Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to explore the history of Eltharion, Prince of Yvresse, Warden of Tor Yvresse, and as he was later known in his life, Eltharion the Grim. Now, Eltharion is considered by many to be one of the greatest of all the Elven lords, having achieved feats of martial prowess that are simply beyond any other. However, let's begin his story during the 260th year of the reign of the Phoenix King Finubar the Seafarer. It was during this time that Eltharion found himself leading a small but committed force into the heart of the Dark Elf lands. When other High Elf princes had attempted the same, skirmishes and ambushes had whittled away their forces until little remained except for desperate survivors, who quickly found themselves rounded up and taken away for tortures too horrific for us to speak of here. Eltharion, though, was resolved to turn the tables, and so he did, launching a brutal campaign into the hearts of Naggaroth. Surprise raids were launched on Dark Elf garrisons, their defenders slaughtered and their buildings razed to the ground before nearby forces could be mustered to their rescue. Where survivors were able to flee, Eltharion's Illyrian reavers rode them down, ensuring no word made its way to the ears of Malekith, the Witch King of Naggaroth. In the shadows, a silent war was also taking place. Bands of shadow warriors ambushed enemy messengers attempting to coordinate a defence, and it sowed terror and confusion deep into the hearts of Dark Elves everywhere. The High Elves of Ulthuan were coming, and they brought vengeful death in their wake. Eventually, Eltharion's force found itself in sight of the mighty city of Naggaron, the heart of Dark Elf society. A protracted siege would cost the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, and Eltharion could not linger on his campaign. The lands of Ulthuan were always under threat, and he needed to return to ensure their enemies did not find them lacking when they too mustered the courage to go on the offensive. So Eltharion and his advisors concocted a clever plan. The boldest and bravest of his force dressed themselves in the clothes of Dark Elf civilians who had been captured on their long march, and wandered into the city posing as refugees fleeing from Eltharion's army. Even Naggarond was not so heartless as to turn away its own, and the elves were let in. They made sure not to linger in the sight of guards and sentries though, instead hunkering down in the corners and darkest parts of the city, and there they waited for nightfall. When the time came, the infiltrators snuck their way to the main gates, quietly dispatching any who were too perceptive for their own good. In moments the gate was opened and a single torch lit, burning with the white light of the High Elves' enmity. Eltharion acted on the cue, and he, along with his entire army, swept into Naggarond. A riot ensued. This was not conflict, it was slaughter. Civilians, soldiers and everything in between fell to the fury of the elvish invaders, and it was not long before everything was engulfed in blood and flame. Having sent a clear message, Eltharion ordered his army to fall back and let his generals head into the fray so as to better contain the raging fury he had so willingly unleashed. This, unfortunately, was to be a huge mistake. With his honour guard now weaker than before, a concealed Dark Elf assassin leaped to Eltharion, driving a poison blade deep into the High Elf's shoulder. Instinct took over, and it took seconds for Eltharion to block a second blow and remove the attacker's head. But it was too late. A dark and powerful poison rushed through Eltharion's blood, and he struggled to remain conscious as the fighting went on around him. Mustering the last of his strength, he ordered a full retreat before his closest advisors carried him from the battle. The campaign had been a monumental success, striking a blow that would be remembered for hundreds if not thousands of years with only the merest of High Elf casualties. But Eltharion had paid a heavy price. As his force landed on the shores of Ulthuan, he was near death, and none around him had the skill to soothe or remove the poison coursing through his veins. Eltharion would die that night, that much was assured. However, in those moments of fevered sleep, Eltharion was woken by a pale apparition, sitting just on the edge of his vision. With horror, he realised that it was none other than his father Moranion, bloodied and mangled from the fire that had so cruelly torn him from his people and his son. With silence and fear gripping Eltharion's heart, the spirit began to speak, in hollow tones at first, telling his son that their ancestral home of Athel Tamara had been destroyed and its lands defiled. This had been at the hands of the goblin warlord Grom, a truly terrible foe who, with a charm and a frightful power at his command, was overwhelming all in his path. Worse still, in their ignorance, the goblin hordes had defiled every watchstone between Athel Tamara and Tor Yvresse, allowing the magical energies that they contained to rack the lands around them. If the Watchstone of Tor Yvresse were to fall too, then a devastation not seen since the Sundering would fall upon Ulthuan, as the world itself tore to pieces. It was as the visions of this final apocalypse overwhelmed Eltharion that he awoke with a jolt, the ghost gone and his vision surprisingly clear. He had, by miracle it seems, been cured of his mortal wound. And yet, as he looked back to where his father's spirit had been, he saw something resting quietly there. A sword, but no ordinary blade. This was the Fang sword, the ancient heirloom of his family, patiently waiting for Eltharion to claim it. The elf knew that this vision, this moment even, was a clear calling from destiny to avenge his father and to save his homeland. He leapt from his bed, grasped the sword and walked out to a huddle of his closest generals, their expressions sorrowful and clearly in mourning. To say that Eltharion's appearance surprised them would be somewhat of an understatement, and he gave no time for their shocked expressions to rest before he told them of his vision and the quest it brought. He ordered their army and ships be readied for the voyage to Tor Yvresse, and not a moment could be spared. The future of the High Elves was at stake. The frantic rush was worth the effort, because when the High Elves arrived to the shores of Yvresse, they found the great city in flames. Grom's forces raged through the city streets, butchering everyone who stood before them. In city squares and major buildings, the city's defenders managed to create defences where they could resist the hordes, but the greenskin tide was relentless. Slowly the warriors of Tor Yvresse were being battered into submission, and there was nothing that they could call on to save them. And above the clouds, Eltharion caught sight of something that made him even more fearful. The goblin shaman soaring on an enormous wyvern, casting off bolts of green lightning and fire from the heavens. Eltharion knew that they had hours at most, and ordered his most loyal soldiers to secure the Warden's Tower and the Watchstone of Tor Yvresse. The rest of the army would hold back the tide for as long as possible, while Eltharion dealt with the shaman. With a defiant cry, the High Elves soared into the city's harbour, while Eltharion took to his mighty griffin, Stormwing, and flew into the skies. The shaman, too busy delighting itself in the carnage below, saw the High Elf almost too late. At the last moment, the greenskin whirled round to cast a deadly lightning blast at Eltharion, who only deflected it with the aid of his enchanted shield, another heirloom gifted to him many years ago. A deadly dance in the skies began, fire and lightning blazing through the heavens as Eltharion deflected those he could, while Stormwing narrowly dodged those he couldn't. Minutes felt like hours, and then suddenly, with Eltharion whirling round in an arc that was slightly too long, the goblin saw his opening. Hissing to himself, his hands burned with a light that shined brighter than the sun, and Eltharion's heart froze as he knew that he had failed his father and his people. But, just as quickly, the spell suddenly died, the goblin looking at his hands in dumb confusion. Eltharion's troops had seized the Warden's Tower and made the invocation of ending, temporarily becalming the winds of magic and robbing the shaman of his powers. Eltharion did not hesitate and rushed forward, and it's said that the goblin's face was still frozen in the expression of dumb confusion when it hit the ground. High Elves cheered and goblins faltered, and even Grom joined the fleeing masses as the High Elves surged forward, culling every greenskin who had sullied their revered city. But Eltharion did not savour this victory, for the danger was not over. He swept down to the Warden's Tower, which was already pulsating with chaotic energies, and asked 4 of his bravest warriors to accompany him. Inside, the energies of the Watchstone flayed and racked around the chamber, a great vortex building above it. The end of the world itself seemed contained to a single space. Looking up at the sight, Eltharion knew that the fate of the High Elves and the world itself rested on these next few moments. However, no one actually knows what did happen in those moments. The energies were calmed, and Eltharion emerged the next morning alone, his expression more grim than any had ever seen it before. Cheers and celebration washed over Tor Yvresse, but even that sight, and the knowledge that his quest was fulfilled, could not conjure a smile from him. Whatever had happened, whatever he had seen, it had changed Eltharion forever. Eventually, in time, Eltharion was elected as Warden of Tor Yvresse, in recognition of his incredible feats during the battle. But, even years after those events, his expression never lifted. He seemed always acutely aware of those few fateful moments in the Warden's Tower, ever pondering what he saw, and thus forever known as Eltharion the Grim.